How is combat changing with the rapid development of unmanned aerial vehicles? We look at the lessons learned from drone combat in Ukraine.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 117 of the Principles of War podcast, Drone Combat in Ukraine. How the unmanned aerial vehicle is changing the character of war. Today, I'm very excited to have on the show Sam Bendett. He is an expert in Russia studies at CNA. In particular, he looks at Russian defense and technology developments, uncrewed, robotic, and autonomous military systems. And I can't think of anyone better than Sam to help us understand the lessons that are being learnt right now in the war in Ukraine. Welcome to the podcast, Sam.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start off with getting a bit of an understanding of what the start state was like as far as UAS were going. What lessons were learnt by Ukraine and Russia from the war in Nagorno-Karabakh?
It's an interesting question because when we talk about drone warfare, we tend to think of Ukraine as sort of the war that really defines how drones are fought. And my guess would be if Ukraine war did not happen, Nagorno-Karabakh would still be this sort of seminal point in our study of drone warfare and how drones are actually used. So the main lessons learned from Nagorno-Karabakh, at least by the Russians who were paying very close attention to what was happening in their own backyard, is of the utmost importance of loitering munitions and air defense systems. And that was on full display by the Azerbaijani military as it used a combination of domestic and imported UAVs and loitering munitions to hammer away at mostly stationary Armenian positions. So the third lesson learned, do not be a stationary force. If you're a stationary force, have a lot of defenses arrayed against the potential adversaries, especially against adversary UAVs. So electronic warfare, jamming systems, radar systems, kinetic systems, anything that can identify, jam, and shoot down a drone was identified as extremely important. Loitering munitions that can be launched in depth of adversary territory up to 40, 50, 60, and beyond kilometers are also very important. And apparently that war also utilized a small amount of commercial drones as well. But that's not what really grabbed the headlines. So for the Russian military, looking at some of the public sourcing and some of the public analysis of that war, they identified, once again, UAVs, loitering munitions, counter UAV defenses, and obviously the need for constant movement and the danger of being a stationary force. Now, of course, that was a very unique conflict because it really pitted the adversaries. One adversary was modernizing rapidly, modernized its military, still used a lot of sort of older infantry tactics, but it was backed by a modern UAV force. The other military, the Armenian military, really kind of thought that they were going to fight the same type of conflict as they did in 1992 through 1994, when they won a lot of Nagorno-Karabakh territory. And so there was a lot of underestimation of the adversary. And lessons from that war were learned, meaning from the early 90s war were learned, but not necessarily modified to meet the new threats and challenges. And so towards the end of that conflict, Armenia sort of got its act together with respect to using electronic warfare, jamming, and air defense systems, and apparently scored a number of successful hits against Azerbaijani drones, but it was essentially too late because they lost the momentum. And so some of those lessons are also transferred to the current ongoing war in Ukraine. And the Russian invasion also underestimated its adversary for a number of reasons, whether or not it had proper intelligence or whether or not it had proper intelligence that was stifled or overly politicized, or whether or not any actionable intelligence about the Ukrainian military was actually ignored in favor of whatever Vladimir Putin thought of Ukraine and Ukrainian military. These are all sort of major factors that contributed to the initial Russian invasion, the quality of that invasion, and obviously to the overall results. I mean, we find ourselves in 2024 simply because Ukrainian military was preparing, was getting ready for the invasion, was training, and proved to be a very, very capable force when compared to whatever Russians thought of themselves and whatever Russians thought of the Ukrainians going forward.
On the battlefield now, we see UAS in general and FPVs in particular changing the way that the combined arms effect is generated. How are they integrating with traditional forces?
So that's a very interesting question. The integration is uneven if we talk about both militaries. On the Ukrainian side, there are Ukrainian companies embedded in the battalion structure. These Ukrainian UAV forces have very adequate and modern communication systems. They're integrated into the larger information flows for any military formation where they are part. They are part of the electronic warfare and other units and formations within the Ukrainian force structure. Essentially, the Ukrainian UAV units get access to overall and contribute to the larger battlefield picture and benefit from very timely identification of targets and very timely review and analysis of Russian movements, maneuvers, and force structure arrayed against them. And Russians are always impressed by this Ukrainian structure. Across the Russian forces, there are UAV squads and UAV crews embedded with assault units, embedded with different units, but it's uneven and it's not necessarily standardized. So in the Russian military, some military forces actually have a very adequate UAV structure, short-range UAVs, FPVs, quadcopters, fixed-wing ISR drones, as well as loitering munitions, while other units do not have adequate number of UAVs, drones do not have adequate training. So that's sort of the tactical picture. When it comes to more operational picture, when it comes to longer range drones, Russia has operated its Lancet and Ku drones and loitering munitions with great success against many Ukrainian assets. Ukraine, on the other hand, so far lacks an equivalent to the Russian Lancet and a Ku loitering munition. They have manufactured at least one such design, but it hasn't been scaled up yet and has not been fielded in the same way as the Russians have. And finally, at the strategic level, both sides are utilizing long-range loitering munitions against each other's energy infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and civilian as well as military targets. And on that level, there's a certain amount of parity between Ukrainian and Russian efforts. Russia is using military-grade Shahed/Gerain drones provided to it by Iran, while Ukraine has manufactured probably about a dozen different long-range one-way attack drones that are hammering away at the Russian energy and other types of infrastructure. So again, at the tactical level, the picture varies. At the slightly higher operational level, Russia may have a slight advantage, but not entirely, simply because it doesn't have enough loitering munitions to truly affect the battlefield situation. And on the larger strategic picture, there's a parity in how drones are fielded, how drones are built, and how drones are utilized against specific targets.
So how is UAS employment related to the lack of artillery? We see a lot in the press about the lack of ammunition and even just the lack of tubes. Are we still seeing tight linkages between the UAS and artillery?
There's been a lot of discussion about Ukrainian forces using short-range FPV drones as artillery surrogates during the worst months of artillery hunger. And Ukrainian tactics in using short-range drones are quite advanced. And Ukrainians have become very successful in using a large number of FPV and quadcopters to identify, track, and target Russian military assets. Ukraine is also using its heavy multi-rotor drones that the Russians have dubbed Baba Yaga, after a witch that comes in the night to steal the children from the Russian and Slavic folk tales. The Baba Yaga drones employed by Ukrainians are quite successful in attacking Russian positions at relatively short ranges. Sometimes these drones are accompanied by fixed-wing ISR drones. They're accompanied by their own quadcopters and FPV drones for additional strikes and greater successes. And that has proven effective against a number of Russian positions. But Russia, as a military force, is the one that is capable of incurring a lot of casualties. So Russia continues to take Ukrainian hit after Ukrainian hit. It loses hundreds of soldiers a day. It can lose thousands of soldiers a week, and it can continue to be in the fight. And so Ukraine tries to utilize as many drones as possible to stem these Russian infantry attacks, but Russia continues inching forward because it is capable of losing a lot of soldiers and still continue forward. But there's an agreement probably on both sides of this war that no matter how successful short-range drones can be, or even some of the longer-range drones can be, there are no true replacement for artillery, because a single artillery shell can cause a lot more damage than even multiple FPV drone strikes. And so artillery still remains the king of the battlefield. And obviously, artillery shells are very much sought after by both sides. But again, at certain sections of the front, in certain situations, in certain battles, short-range FPV drones and quadcopters can prove quite successful in targeting advancing adversaries.
We're seeing prodigious losses of Russian armoured vehicles. How is manoeuvre being affected and how is it being achieved in Ukraine today?
Well, the ubiquitous presence of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones that guide artillery, mortar, and other FPVs to target, the presence of thousands of short-range FPV drones all across the line of contact and along the entire front has made movement by big vehicles an extremely dangerous endeavor. And we've seen how this evolved from 2022, when soldiers and vehicles could move in significant numbers during day and at night, and how that started to change in 2023 when there were more and more drones in the air that were able to identify any target, anything that moved, essentially, to movements that were even restricted at night, because now a lot of drones have thermal imagers and night vision equipment, and they can basically track anything that moves. So right now, on the battlefield, a single soldier can be tracked and targeted. Any vehicle can be tracked and targeted, no matter how big. It doesn't mean that maneuvering and movement by vehicles is not necessarily done. What has happened is that the side on the defensive, or the side that incurs a lot of attacks, is now fielding a lot of counter UAV defenses, both physical defenses like cages and slat armor that we've seen fielded by the Russians as well as by the Ukrainians, and electronic warfare equipment, which can be mounted on vehicles both large and small. That equipment doesn't always work as advertised. It doesn't always provide effective coverage, but sometimes it does. There's a lot more tactical electronic warfare that now exists with soldier units, individual soldiers, groups of soldiers and squads, equipment that could be easily moved, easily transferred. But ultimately, any significant movement is very difficult right now. And so that's why we don't have a lot of breakthroughs on the front that are spearheaded by a large number of vehicles of different types. The Russians have even created these so-called barn tanks. So much physical protection on top of a tank that it looks like a moving barn, essentially, a moving warehouse, a moving house. That doesn't always defend against FPV drones, because FPV drones can be maneuvered into the smallest opening, including in situations where tanks and armored vehicles are supposed to be fully protected. But it does provide a certain measure of security and protection in many situations. And so what you see are these very heavily defended tanks trying to clear a way for other tanks and other armored vehicles and infantry in limited assault operations. It's unclear if this is going to be a long-term practice or a long-term tactic. These type of physical protections on top of a tank aren't always standardized. They're ad hoc. Different units have different access to different materials that could be mounted on tanks. But ultimately, what the UAVs have done, that they were able to provide almost a full and complete coverage of the battlefield in ways that wasn't available before. And so once again, any movement by soldiers, any movement by vehicles is now tracked as well as attacked very quickly.
So looking at the counter-UAS battle, there's a selection bias in the ISR feeds that we see on social media. So we don't see many of the misses and we don't see the routine missions and the UAS losses. But is the counter-UAS battle being lost?
No, not at all. I think you've hit on a very important point. What we see on social media, what we see in the public domain, the videos of successful strikes that we see are only a small fraction of the actual battle taking place. Both sides of this war are using social media to amplify their message and to diminish the adversarial efforts. And therefore, successful drone strikes against all manner of assets, vehicles, and soldiers is absolutely paramount in that informational narrative. But the reality is that one of every, let's say, 6, 7, 9, sometimes even 10 strikes can be successful for a number of reasons. Obviously, adversary counter-UAS defenses can negate the effects of FPV drones. Physical protection, like nets on vehicles across trenches, can be quite successful. Different ways of moving around at day, at night can actually negate those effects as well. Electronic warfare systems that are fielded can be successful in negating the effects of FPV drones, quadcopters, and other drones. Many drones which are delivered to the front by the volunteers in large quantities are not standardized. So some of them suffer from bad quality. They don't always take off out of the box. Even when they take off, they can sometimes fly a short distance before they crash. There are technical difficulties. There's a lot of electronic warfare fratricide, which is taking place with both sides jamming their own drones and leading to significant losses. So you don't see a lot of bad hits in videos. You don't see them on social media. You can occasionally catch that, for example, a Russian Lancet loading munition filmed by Russia's own ISR drone can actually film a near miss or an actual miss where the drone really strays far from target. But ultimately, again, the public narrative that we are viewing right now and are part of only shows a fraction of what's going on the battlefield, and it certainly doesn't show all of the failures and all the missing action when it comes to UAVs. But again, it doesn't mean that counter-UAS tactics are not successful. They are uneven at different sections of the front. The technology that forms many counter-UAS efforts and electronic warfare efforts by both sides can also be uneven. It could be a mix or a combination of military and commercial grade tech. It could be a mix of technology provided by the military forces or technology provided by the volunteers, which is based on commercial components. So it's a real mix and match and varies across the sections of the front, and also varies because of battlefield conditions as well. Varies because of weather, varies because of the terrain, it varies because of the skill by drone pilots as well as people who operate and field different types of counter-UAV technologies.
So we've seen some platforms struggling in a comms contested environment, and we've seen some providers have their drones returned because they just can't operate on the battlefield. What are we seeing in the EW space?
Again, EW space, as I just mentioned, it varies significantly. The EW space is evolving just as quickly as drone technologies are evolving. The advantage that is gained by one side in electronic warfare doesn't last very long because the other side adapts. There are a lot of military-grade technologies present at the front, as well as many technologies donated and fielded by the volunteers. On both sides, soldiers still spend their own resources to purchase certain types of electronic warfare and counter-UAS equipment, mostly made with commercial technologies and donated by the volunteers. So again, there is no standardized approach to how specific units across the front are fielding different types of electronic warfare and counter-UAS technologies. As I indicated earlier, there are sections of the front which are well-stocked with well-trained crews and well-trained technologies. There are sections of the front which are missing both skills and technologies as well. Electronic warfare varies from unit to unit, certainly on the Russian side, and sometimes on the Ukrainian side as well. There are attempts by the militaries to standardize this approach, to create a unified approach to how electronic warfare is fielded. But again, a lot of fighting right now is taking place at the tactical level, and there are a lot of different types of tactical level electronic warfare systems present. Radio electronic reconnaissance has become very important as well, and that is the ability to identify drone frequencies in flight and the ability to determine whether a specific frequency belongs to a specific type of UAV, as well as to identify the distance and range of that UAV from one's location. Some of these devices are also commercial grade and are provided by volunteers as well. So again, some of the units have a very ad hoc approach to electronic warfare. Some units have a very organized approach to electronic warfare. But overall, electronic warfare really varies from one section of the front to another, from one specific formation to another.
We've started to see UAS versus UAS combat, reminiscent really of air combat in 1914, with platforms deliberately flying into other drones. Are we likely to see UAS air superiority concepts emerge with UAS fighters?
That's quite possible. Already we have debates on both sides of the front on the development of different types of tactics to target adversarial fixed-wing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones, as well as targeting heavy multi-rotor drones, which normally fly kind of low and slow and could be quite significant targets. There are discussions about combining electronic warfare, radio electronic reconnaissance, and these type of tactical drone strikes against adversarial drones as well. Some of these attacks happen ad hoc, meaning one drone operator simply sighted another drone which looks like an adversarial drone and attacks it. Some of these attacks are well planned and premeditated. But the Russians, for example, sounded concern a few weeks ago that Ukrainians are becoming more and more successful in targeting Russian fixed-wing ISR drones like Orlan, like Zala, like Supercam, drones which are extremely important in providing Russians with situational awareness of the Ukrainian battlefield. Ukrainians have also complained that some of these fixed-wing ISR drones have penetrated deep inside Ukrainian territory and are flying unimpeded. So not only is there a need to shoot them down, but there are also different ways of doing so. Ukraine, for example, fielded a light turboprop aircraft recently to go after Russian ISR fixed-wing drones. A lot of these attacks, again, are happening with FPV drones. Some of these attacks can happen with more successful UAVs. And so any type of an advantage gained by one side doesn't last very long and is almost immediately countered by some form of a defensive tactic. And so each side is now racing to develop tactics and technologies to target each other's drones while in flight. That can lead to a very interesting consequence where there will be so many drone attacks taking place that the overall effectiveness of some of these drones, whether they're FPVs or quadcopters or even fixed wing, will diminish because they will be targeted to a significant extent by adversarial UAV assets. But we're sort of far from that right now. What we have at the moment is sort of the beginning of the development, I guess, of tactics for targeting adversarial drones while in flight. And again, this will probably generate a number of defensive tactics, which will in turn generate additional offensive tactics to take down those drones, which will once again generate defensive tactics, and so on and so forth.
We've seen a fair number of platforms failing and falling into enemy hands. Are we seeing developments in the intelligence exploitation of these platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. On Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels, you can see different units actually displaying adversarial drones that they shut down. They are usually disassembling these drones to learn what's inside. Some of these drones are actually fixed and put back in the fight. And the larger, heavier, more sophisticated drones are usually sent to the respective military forces for further examination. And so this, again, happens with light drones, cheap drones. It happens with sophisticated drones. The need to learn about adversarial developments is absolutely paramount. It is part of the regular tactics. There are now concepts and tactics that exist and are made public on how to approach an adversarial drone that was shut down because it could be rigged to explode. And so there are different TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures on how to take down adversarial drones, how to approach them, and also how to disassemble and study them as well.
So some of in particular the FPV drones, they're fitted with very cheap IR cameras so that they can operate at night. How are the economics of UAS changing?
Well, right now, when it comes to most FPV developments for both Russian and Ukrainian forces, there's a great dependence on Chinese components to assemble these drones. And that dependence isn't going away anytime soon. Both sides actually depend to a very significant extent on acquiring these Chinese-made components in bulk to assemble large numbers of FPV drones and cheap quadcopters. There's also reliance on Chinese-made DJI drones, especially the Mavic series, for both ISR as well as limited combat. And both sides are still using those drones in large quantities as well. So the dependence on imports isn't going away anytime soon. Both sides, however, are claiming that their industries are now capable of manufacturing a growing number of components that could be used in place of Chinese-made components, but again, not in large enough numbers to affect the acquisition and development of tens of thousands of FPV-type drones each month. In fact, Russians sometimes are publicly saying that when it comes to many of these type of UAVs, tactical UAVs, they're almost 100% dependent on Chinese-made components. And so the main goal for the Ukrainian industry, and for the Russian industry for that matter, is to lessen that dependence and to manufacture as many domestic parts as possible to assemble fully domestic FPV drones or fully domestic quadcopters. It doesn't mean that either side will actually field a quadcopter that can fully replace a DJI Mavic. Both sides claim to actually build such drones already, but again, not in big enough quantities, and certainly there's no feedback yet from the soldiers on using these drones in combat. Everybody, when they talk on Telegram, when it comes to fundraising for the war effort, everybody on both sides is still going after a DJI Mavic drone as probably the most important tactical UAV right now in this war, next to the FPV type drone.
So what sort of scale is Ukraine producing drones in then? What's their monthly production rates?
And that's a very good question, and that's a question that generates a lot of controversy. So last summer, Royal United Services Institute published a very interesting and relevant report on the war, and in that report, they said that Ukraine can lose up to 10,000 drones each month. So that was, I think, by August of 2023. Since then, a number of drones in either military force has grown, and the volunteers and civil societies on both sides are manufacturing tens of thousands, if not more, of FPV drones for their own military. And this is probably one of the more significant aspects of this war, this unprecedented involvement of civil society in acquiring, in purchasing, in developing, assembling, testing, and delivering different types of technologies used in the war, which includes FPV drones, which includes different types of quadcopters, fixed-wing drones, which includes munitions, parts for munitions, and everything else that is needed by soldiers in their daily fighting. And so last, I believe, November, one of the Ukrainian publications basically talked about the size and scale of FPV production, and it indicated that Ukrainian efforts altogether can manufacture up to 50,000 FPV drones. And the Ukrainian defense industry probably can manufacture up to several thousand different types of UAVs. That same article estimated that Russians can manufacture up to 300,000 FPV drones per month, if all of the volunteer efforts combined are taken together. Earlier this year, there were estimates from the Russian volunteers, from certain specific organizations that claim that they alone can manufacture up to 100,000 FPV drones across their enterprises in Russia. Ukraine says that, or rather Ukrainian commentators often say that Russia is a big country, has a bigger population, has a bigger industrial capacity, has easier access to Chinese-made components, and therefore can manufacture lots and lots of UAVs. And so when it comes to FPV drones specifically, when it comes to drones in general, I think the picture varies, depending on who is talking, depending what kind of information they have, and what kind of estimates they have. So let's talk about tactical drones specifically. It is entirely possible that Ukraine can manufacture up to 50,000 FPV drones per month, simply because the losses of these short-range tactical cheap drones are quite significant. It is also entirely possible that Russians can manufacture a very large number of FPV drones. But as I indicated earlier, a lot of these drones can suffer from technical issues. Some of them will not fly, let's say, out of the box. There will be some other technical problems with them. There will be a lot of operator error. Missions will be unsuccessful. But ultimately, the number of drones flown at the tactical level really depends on the number of operators. And so if each side fields several thousand drone operators, and those can fly, let's say, several drones per day, then we can talk about a large number. But again, not a number that encompasses, let's say, hundreds of thousands of UAVs. There's not enough pilots to fly all of those. At other levels, you have fewer drones, which are multi-purpose, multi-use, and can be obviously more effective in many ways than a single-use kamikaze-type one-way attack drone. And so both sides are probably operating several thousand different types of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance UAVs. And their fielding probably varies from one section of the front to another. And obviously, when it comes to more strategic level drones, the ones that can fly for 1,000 kilometers or more, Ukraine does not manufacture a lot of those, although there were claims made last December that Ukrainian industry can manufacture at least 1 million FPV drones this year and close to 10,000 different types of other drones, of which 1,000 are going to be these long-range attack drones. Russia, for its part, wants to manufacture up to 6,000 Shahed/Gerain loading munitions each year and has already used several thousand of these drones in the previous year. So the numbers can be significant, again, depending on what is our benchmark for evaluating these numbers, right? Both civil societies in this war can, in fact, assemble a very large number of short-range one-way attack drones like FPVs, but their use will really depend on the quality of those drones and on the number of pilots, meaning we don't see tens of thousands of videos of FPV strikes. Each month we see several hundred to maybe a few thousand at the most, because the number of missions flown depends on a lot of other factors. So we can vary, right, the number. Let's say Ukraine can manufacture at least 50,000 drones per month. Russian volunteer efforts altogether can maybe manufacture between 50 to 100,000 drones per month. But out of that large number, only so many drones are actually going to fly, and only so many of those strikes are going to be successful that we will finally see them on social media.
You talk about the pilots. President Zelensky's spoken about the development of the Ukrainian Army Drone Corps. What do we expect this to look like, and how pervasive will UAS skills be throughout the army?
So what's interesting is that there's a difference between tactical FPV type quadcopter training versus training on more military-grade, longer-range drones versus military operation of drones that can range 1,000 kilometers or even more. When it comes to FPV type drones, when it comes to flying DJI Mavic type quadcopters, most of that training has been conducted by volunteers. A lot of that training has been conducted by different types of civil society organizations on their own funding, based on their own fundraising. That's certainly the case on the Russian side. That is slowly changing, with the military now becoming more involved in drone pilot training and operation. On the Ukrainian side, the standardization of some of the training, as well as drone manufacturing, is having a positive effect. The establishment of an official drone force in the Ukrainian military is going to lead to streamlining a lot of the training, development, and fielding efforts. It's going to lead to standardization of both training the pilots and operators, as well as for development of technology. On the Russian side, there are multiple organizations embedded with the Ministry of Defense, which are supposed to oversee different types of autonomous and robotics developments, but it is unlikely that those organizations were involved or could really understand the impact and significance of short-range tactical FPV-type drones, the same way that Ukrainians have, for example. And so there were hints from the Russian military that they will also establish sort of a different organization that would be involved in the development of some of the systems that are fielded by the Russian military forces, like tactical UAVs, tactical unmanned ground vehicles, will cooperate more with non-military institutions for, again, standardization of all approaches, technical approaches, as well as learning approaches. So having an actual force can be effective if that UAV force can be effectively led and effectively fielded. But as we have indicated earlier, different sections of the front have different quality performance, both by drone crews as well as by soldiers and other technologies.
How are both sides utilizing AI in their platforms?
That's a very good question. There's a lot of discussion about that already, and there's lots of claims. Certainly, Ukraine claims to be ahead of Russia in that regard, and that simple AI solutions for terrain mapping, terrain recognition, and object recognition technologies are already fielded. There was evidence in some of the Western media that Ukraine's long-range one-way attack drones are fielding this type of limited AI when they fly across Russian territory on the way to a specific target. There were claims made by lots of Ukrainian developers and startups, as well as by the Russian developers and startups, that they are testing and fielding different types of AI applications in FPV drones and quadcopters and fixed-wing drones as well. The main benefit from fielding artificial intelligence in UAVs is lessening the dependence on operator, simply because the communication between the drone and the operator could be identified and interrupted and intercepted by electronic warfare systems. So whether it's a terminal lock where the drone flies at identified target sort of during the last mile, whether the drone flies and actually identifies something that looks like a target and waits for operator approval, or any number of those qualifications, or even more or less independent flight by a drone to target, independent identification of target with a human operator only approving the final strike. All of that is now discussed as a way to make UAVs more effective, to lessen the dependence on operator, and enable large-scale strikes and accurate strikes against identified targets. We are seeing a lot of discussions. We're seeing some of these technologies fielded, but we're not necessarily seeing a mass-scale application of these technologies yet, probably because of some of the technical challenges that exist in developing training data for these AI algorithms, or in actually fielding and building these type of UAVs at scale.
That's excellent. Thank you very much for your time and for your vast experience in UAS Combat in Ukraine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so a big thank you there to Sam Bendett. You can see a lot of experience in the analysis of drone combat in Ukraine, both from the Ukrainian point of view and from the Russian point of view. And I think he's brought out some very salient lessons for us all to learn.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.